We're very fortunate to have representatives from the American Farmland Trust, Samantha Levy and Jimmy Daukas, I think. And I actually listened to a presentation that Samantha, anyway, maybe Jimmy put out in New York State about their Greener Fields report, which was amazing to me. And they made the very strong argument that doing something as simple as farmland protection has a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions and is a huge part of the climate solution, deck. And so tonight, they're going to talk about farmland protection, smart solar siting, and improving soil health to sequester carbon. And just a little bit, Samantha is the New York policy manager for the American Farmland Trust. And I hope you'll give us, one or both of you will give us a little bit of background into what the American Farmland Trust is and how it originated. And Jimmy Daukas is and Samantha's located in Saratoga Springs in upstate New York. And Jimmy Daukas is located in Washington, D.C., and he's the senior program officer in the American Farmland Trust. And he has in his wheelhouse efforts on the part of the American Farmland Trust to combat climate change. And he's also the liaison for the American Farmland Trust to the Coalition on Agriculture Greenhouse Gases, which you all have heard me talk about before.
Thank you very much for inviting us to participate. Jan, thank you for asking us to join. It's a great series. I've been listening to some of the past speakers that you've had, so it's actually impressive, and it's great that you are putting it up on the web for people to hear. So I want to thank you very much for that. Samantha, we'll go to the next slide. So as Jan asked, just some quick background on American Farmland Trust for those of you who are not familiar with us. We started in 1980, a group of farmers and conservationists and landowners were really interested in the working land side of land protection, right? There are a lot of organizations that have been working on habitat and other kinds of land protection. But people were interested in how do we protect land and ensure that it continues as working land, farmland and ranch land, and how can we help to ensure that there's a sort of a next generation taking on that land and ensuring that it continues as working land, as productive farmland. We have a three-pronged mission. We are committed to saving the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, our best farmland, from development or for conversion out of agriculture. Second is promoting environmentally sound farming practices, right? You can protect the land, but then it's how we manage the land is the second piece. And then the third piece of it is, we call it keeping farmers on the land, but it's thinking about the next generation and how do we keep land accessible to new and beginning farmers, and how do we keep it active in agriculture. And we like to say that we work from the kitchen table where a lot of decisions are made all the way up to Congress. As you probably know, a lot of land use decisions and a lot of land policy gets done at the local level. So we are at the kitchen table working with landowners and farmers. We are at the the local, county, and state, and then we will also work at the federal level. Next slide. So because of your background and your interest in climate change, and also the series of speakers you've already had, I'm going to be assuming that there's a good awareness of the opportunity for farmers and farmland or agriculture to play a positive role in combating climate change. Also that you're aware of some of the challenges that farmers and landowners face with a changing climate, right? Few people are going to feel the effects as pronounced and as immediate as farmers and ranchers and landowners, right? With changing weather and changing climate. And so at a time when we need kind of more agriculture, with the world population increasing and with a demand for more local food and more resilient local food systems, both losing agricultural land and also losing some of the productivity by the impacts from climate change or a changing climate is just not sustainable. But as I even heard on some of your speaker series, really what we have to do is think about the solutions. And that's where one of the great stories is here in agriculture. The solutions, we believe, are relatively straightforward, that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to a changing climate. And relatively straightforward and benefiting everyone if we think about the land, and we think about the soil, the carbon sequestration, that's part of that. And we work to try to get policies to support that. So AFT in our climate work thinks about 3 different strategies: protecting farmland and promoting smart growth to significantly reduce emissions. And that's one of the things we want to talk a little bit about here, because that's often overlooked when we're thinking about agriculture. Second is improving soil health to reduce climate change and improve productivity. And I think that's a really important thing, right? Because agriculture can affect and reduce emissions, but also it's one of the few things that can help reverse climate change, right? It draws down carbon from the atmosphere. And we're going to need that if we're going to hit the kind of targets that we're going to need. And lastly, and it really, this third one supports the other 2, but building support among the farm community, as Jen was just talking about, outreach and engagement from farmers and ranchers, so that we can advance policies to try to promote these. So let's go to the next slide. So as I said, on the land side of things, the farmland protection and compact growth, we feel like this is an often overlooked area. There's a lot of talk about carbon farming and things like that, but it starts with the land, and we need to protect the land. And the Nicholas Institute down at Duke University did some work for California, just looking at that state, but we believe that it applies to most states and across the country. And they concluded, after looking at all the opportunities, right, for mitigation opportunities for agriculture, that farmland preservation or farmland protection, more than any other single management activity, will have the single greatest impact in stabilizing and reducing future emissions across multiple land uses. So what they're saying is on a scale, if we're looking at one practice like just a cover crop or something, that we really need to be thinking about protecting the land and thinking about how we manage and how we grow and sprawling development and things like that. Going to the next slide. And so part of that is AFT then said, it's part of our mission too, to protect ag land. But what we found is that in some of the state's climate plans and strategies, this was somewhat overlooked, right? We were, again, talking a lot about practices. All of the carbon markets are about practices. But we did some research based on some UC Davis research, looking at the amount of emissions from urban and suburban and rural areas. And then we looked at what might be the impact of reducing the conversion of farmland to development and having better compact growth. So the conclusion of our report in California was reducing the conversion of California farmland to development by 50% by 2030 and 75% by 2050 would save 750,000 acres of ag land, while eliminating greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to taking nearly 2 million cars off the road. So these are really big numbers, right? And this is the land use side of things. And so we've been looking at that research, and trying to replicate it. And so I'm going to stop on this area because Samantha's going to talk about this research. That's some of the research that Jan heard Samantha do, and we replicated in New York and found similar results. But again, really important things. So let's protect the land and let's do smart growth there. If we have the land protected, then we can start talking about changing farming practices and thinking about carbon sequestration. So let's go to the next slide. The only thing that I wanted, I guess one more thing that I wanted to say there is part of the, and you as activists would know, part of the important thing is once we're doing kind of research, we need to get it into policy. And so one of the things that happened in California was by making the case, we were able to, with others working in partnership and with agricultural groups supporting this as well, we were able to get California to use some of the climate dollars to help fund this kind of land use planning and farmland protection. And so now you have a nice connection between the two and where climate funds are actually being used to protect this as part of their overall greenhouse gas strategy. Next slide. So one other thing that I wanted to touch on, because I think it's really interesting, and I think you guys as activists will, and advocates are really interested. We think about it from the land side of things before we get into carbon sequestration is solar siting. Now, we're all in favor of solar renewable energy. We need a lot more of it. But one of the things that we're finding in areas around the country, we're getting many more calls about, is solar siting on some of our best farmland. So we've got a tension here. We got a competition for this land. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is work to try to have what we call smart solar siting. And one of the things that we found happened, and we see it in New York, Samantha maybe be able to comment on it in the Q&A, is that some of this concern and confusion has led actually to a moratorium on solar siting, which is like a lose-lose situation, right? Because people are worried about where it might be sited and if we're going to lose some of our best farmland. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that AFT has been recently doing as part of our climate efforts is trying to promote smart solar siting, which would maximize the potential for solar while minimizing the impact on our most productive farmland and our resilient habitat. So let's, let's resolve some of these issues so that we can fast track the solar siting while not having it be in our best land. There's a series of kind of activities that are going on that can help support that. I'm not going to go into all those details. We could pick it up in the Q&A if you'd like to. But we're just seeing it as a real flashpoint in a lot of areas, getting a lot of calls about that. So let's go to the, okay. So the second part of our climate work is on soil health, improving soil health. And you guys have heard from a series of speakers about soil health. You heard from Keith from the South Dakota Corn Growers Association, and just about the potential here. And again, a win-win if we can overcome some of the barriers. And we really believe in AFT, American Farmland Trust, works with all sizes of agriculture, because we believe in order to solve this, we need this on tens of millions of acres. But in order to do that, you've got to overcome some barriers. The things that we focused on are financing. That is, is there enough cost share dollars? One of your participants were talking about the Farm Bill and the squeeze on dollars for conservation while the dollars are being discussed in what we call Title I and the milk program and things like that. So there isn't enough financing for soil health practices. So we need more money there, but maybe we also need to, and I'd like to bring it up later, is think about some other ways, corporations coming in to invest, maybe actually consumers. I mean, one of the most effective ways to get dollars in to change practices is through the organic program, right? The organic labeling. So there's a role for corporations there. A second area of barrier is, this gets a little geeky, but there are tools to track and quantify the benefits that help farmers and landowners understand what happens when you do cover crops and when you do conservation tillage. Well, it turns out that it can produce increases in yields and help with productivity. But a lot of farmers don't know what it is on their land. They don't know quite how it would play out and how it pencils out. So we believe that that's another barrier to this widespread adoption. Third thing is advanced multi-year technical assistance. Some of this is actually transitioning from conventional to a conservation cropping system. And I'm not even saying transferring out to all organic or transferring out to something completely different. This is just introducing tillage and understanding how to do it well, introducing cover cropping, introducing crop rotations and things like that. And New York, actually, Samantha and her team have just gotten a grant from USDA, the SARE program there, to give some training on advanced soil health training that will help to train the trainers who would then go out and help the farmers. So again, another thing that we're working on to try to overcome the barriers. Last piece is interesting thing that a lot of acreage, a third of all the acres, is rental land. And what we find across the country is that the rental land and the relationship between renting and ownership is a big barrier, because the owner of the land is different than the person who's managing it. And when we're trying to get conservation on the ground, sometimes year-to-year leases are actually being a barrier to the kind of investment that you would want a farmer to actually undertake. And what we've learned from some research is that the farmers who are actually renting and owning do more conservation on the land they own than on the land they rent. So this is a bad situation, right? We got to overcome that. And so we're working on that, trying to figure out, to understand it better, and then to try to figure out some ways to overcome some of the risk reasons for why there are short-term leases. Let's go to the next one. So those are just areas where we're doing research. Actually, Samantha, I think the way this slot is set up, you have to hit it twice to get, So the last piece of it is trying to, as you guys have talked a little bit about, engage and talk with agriculture, support agriculture, but also help agriculture be spokespeople, some of the ones who are leaders, so that we actually develop a voice. A lot has changed over the last 5, 6, certainly the last 10 years, with agriculture stepping up, talking a lot about soil health. So I think that's changed, and that helps us to then support these kind of policies that will promote climate smart agriculture or carbon farming or things. The last thing that I wanted to say there is a bit of, let's go back one. There is a bit of federal policy going on, and there's frustrations at that level. But I would just suggest and submit to all of the people listening in that there's a real opportunity to operate at the state level, and states are more active now than they have been in the past. Certainly, there are states that have signed on to this U.S. Climate Alliance. This is the states that sort of stepped up with the vacuum of President Trump's pulling out of, or saying that he's going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. 16 states have stepped up, and it's bipartisan now that you have Maryland on board. But states stepping up and saying, we're going to do this on the state. So now they're committed to that, and they're trying to figure out how to actually kind of hit climate goals. And I think that your group and your network can fill in there and try to help to advocate for them. All right, last slide is, I'm very excited about this. This is an Annie's pasta and an Annie's graham cracker box. And on that box is picture of soil health. And so this is one of the first times where we have consumers and the brands getting involved and taking that next step, right? We've done organic, we've done lots of other things, but this is actually about soil health. I'm not sure how it'll work. It's really interesting though, and it's very exciting because if brands get involved in it, and if we can use this as an education opportunity, suddenly have people going, what the heck is that? And then what's soil health? And I didn't know that that has an impact. And so I think there's a real education opportunity. And so very exciting to see this. So I'm going to stop here. So that's sort of an overview. And one of the things that we decided to do, especially since Janet's seen Samantha's presentation, Samantha's going to take us down into a piece of research that we did. Again, we did it in California, and then we replicated it in New York. And we think that it could be replicated other places, but Samantha will tell you how it played out in New York. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jimmy. Can everybody hear me? Jimmy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I see nodding. Great. So it's such a pleasure to be here amongst friends and climate change activists. I can tell you that I got interested in working in agriculture because of climate change, and the opportunities for agriculture to mitigate climate change and looking at the impacts of climate change on agriculture. So it's really great to be here speaking to you about this piece of research that we did in New York. I'm going to let you know that the PDF of the report can be downloaded online. I'm going to give you the web address at the end of the presentation, so feel free to open it up and look through it. But I'm going to basically take you through our process here, why the research, what we found, how we did the research, what we found, and then how it can be applied. So first I'll give you just a small overview, because I assume that this is, I know that CCL is national, so I don't know if everybody here is from New York. But essentially in New York, agriculture is no small thing. It's a $39 billion industry supporting 160,000 jobs, and it uses a quarter of the state's land, which is pretty significant. And yet, since 1980, we've lost 5,000 farms to development. And at its height, that was about 3 farms per week, and on average 5,800 acres per year. And that number is important to remember as I go through this. Why did we do this research? As Jimmy mentioned, the very first time this type of research was done was by UC Davis for Yolo County, looking at greenhouse gas emissions from cropland versus developed land. And then AFT took that idea and did research statewide and published that research. And the question that we asked is very similar. We looked to do similar research in New York State, asking, how does this conversion of farmland to development impact climate change? And as you can see here, this is a photograph. On the left side there is a farm, and on the right side, what used to be a farm. It was actually, I believe, a century farm that was converted to development here. So we wanted to ask, what impact would it have on greenhouse gas emissions if we were to steer development into existing downtowns and cities and away from our farmland? And this, just to note, this report is based on fundamental beliefs that I assume we all share, which is that climate change is real and it's caused by human action, that it will affect all humans, and that human beings all play a role in stopping it and mitigating climate change. So our methods were really simple, very, very simple. We wanted to find a simple way to quantify emissions and acres for agricultural land and developed land. So essentially, we had this equation, emissions and acres for agricultural land versus emissions and acres for developed land. Took an average statewide and then compared them. Our study area covered 43 New York counties with a mixture of land uses. We did not include highly urbanized areas. As you can see, New York City was not included. We also did not include highly rural areas that have little development pressure, and also excluded counties with very little agricultural activity. So we were looking to get a really representative statewide average of greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural land versus developed land. Now, to get the total emissions data, the numerator of that equation, we used available data from NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And this data came from the 2010 county level greenhouse gas inventories, which was funded by NYSERDA's Cleaner, Greener Communities program. Our developed land emissions included on-road transportation, which in New York State accounts for about 34% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state, incredibly high number. Residential energy consumption, which is the second highest at 15%. Commercial energy consumption at 11.5%. And then also industrial energy consumption, energy generation and supply, industrial processes, and solid waste management, like landfill and sewage. Now, on the agricultural side, the emissions included enteric fermentation, manure emissions, fertilizer emissions, and off-road emissions from things like tractors. Now, to get the total acres, the denominator of the equation on each side, we took data from the National Land Cover Database and then separated it out by county and by county areas covered in development or agriculture. So the developed lands included low, medium, and high density development, and the agricultural areas included cropland, pasture, and hay. For the results, we compiled all the county level emissions data, took the average per acre for agricultural land and developed land, as I said, and found that on average throughout New York, agricultural land emissions from agricultural land were 0.7 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre per year. And from developed land, over 45 megatons of CO2 equivalent per acre per year. And essentially resulting in this comparison that on average, an acre of farmland in New York produces 66 times fewer greenhouse gases than an acre of developed land. Now, this is similar to the results that came out of California. And as Jimmy already mentioned, California took some really incredible action based on that research. Before I get to that, I'll go into the thought experiment that we did. So we modeled the situation starting in 2017, which is when this report was published, with a loss of, like I said, 5,800 acres per year. We assumed that loss, and then decreased this loss by 10% per year until overall we had 80% reduction. And then we calculated the difference in emissions between those acreages if in farmland or developed land today versus without any intervention versus what it would be if there were intervention of the kind that I just described. And essentially came to the conclusion that if the annual loss of farmland to real estate development in New York was reduced by 80% by 2050, that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to taking 1 million cars from the road. And I'm sure you all know that vehicle miles traveled are a really incredible contributor to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and that also they're one of the most difficult to go after with policy. And recognizing that this data is static and it's a snapshot in time, this was a thought experiment. And it's not quite a perfect comparison. And of course, to deepen this research, to find the real quantified greenhouse gas emissions, it would be great if researchers were to look at the difference between greenhouse gas emissions from low density development versus high density development and compare and model scenarios of the same that I've described. But what is clear is exactly what Jimmy just said. So this report that was published from Duke University in 2014 was a literature review, as he said, included all studies that quantified greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and concluded that farmland preservation, in particular permanent farmland preservation, keeping land and farming forever, more than any other management activity, will likely have the single greatest impact in stabilizing and reducing future emissions across multiple land use categories. So in terms of how to apply this research, we saw an example from California, but there are also opportunities to apply this research in local, state, and federal policy and in your advocacy, and I'll explain our thinking on that now. Obviously in California, we saw a policy model, what we consider a policy model here in New York. Jimmy mentioned that the California Air Resources Board allocated $40 million to go towards both permanent farmland protection and a version of smart growth planning, essentially how permanent farmland protection can contribute to steering development into existing downtowns and cities. We in New York see this as an incredible model for a dual policy that can work together to influence smart growth planning. And get at this, the biggest offender, the vehicle miles, the greenhouse gas emissions from vehicle miles traveled. And in addition, in 2017, California also allocated $7.5 million to go towards their Healthy Soils initiative, which is pretty incredible. So they're definitely on the cutting edge. So you're all citizens here. We have some, now I'm going to go into the recommendations for each. It's going to be basically by category of group. We're all citizens here, and we can all, I'm assuming that many of you already shop at farm stands and farmers markets and other places that sell local farm products. But I recommend, in addition to asking them about how they grow their food, talk with farmers about the challenges they face in keeping their farm, and keeping their land, and keeping their land in farming. You can also reach out to your local land trust about their efforts to protect farmland and potentially even volunteer. A lot of land trusts are small nonprofits and can really benefit from having people who are passionate help them out. And to do what you do, encourage public leaders to support funding and initiatives that protect farmland permanently and promote climate smart farming practices. I already spoke a little bit about how researchers can help. We can look at alternative land use scenarios such as higher density versus lower density and figure out the associated impact on greenhouse gas emissions to take this research even deeper. Also, estimating the climate change impacts of farmers expanding the use of climate smart practices on their soil. There's already quite a lot of that research going on, and always could be more. And then also exploring ways for farmers to successfully have renewable energy generated on their farm while also keeping their most productive land in farming. And that's something that Jimmy already spoke about. But it's incredibly important, as he alluded to here in New York, where we are receiving many phone calls from local government officials looking for guidance, basically, because solar developers are leasing farmland at pretty incredible rates, or targeting farmland at incredible rates. Some of you might be farmers, or I know you probably know some farmers. If you're a farmer, you can investigate options for permanently protecting your farmland. And we here at AFT run the Farmland Information Center, or the FIC, which is at www.farmlandinfo.org. You can find a lot of information there on permanent farmland protection. Even for your purposes, going and looking through the resources on that website, they're really great. And Jimmy can even speak a little bit more about specifically what's housed on that website. But we've got quite a lot of information there. Adopting climate smart farming practices such as cover crops or reduced tillage. And again, looking at generating renewable energy while keeping your best land in production. So here's what you all really probably want to know more about. Being people who go and speak to your federal leaders and potentially even your state leaders, helping to make this connection, promoting this type of research, making this connection between permanent farmland protection and a climate change mitigation agenda. It's really important to incorporate these types of policies in a state or a federal agenda to combat climate change. And also looking to, a lot of states have plans that they're doing, a lot of counties, a lot of local governments, encouraging them to include protecting farmland and promoting local and regional food systems in their plans for land conservation or economic development are really important, because many of the laws, at least in New York State, many of the local laws that need to be passed have to have backing in the plan. And then finally, encouraging our state and federal and local leaders, because local governments also tend to commit some funding, or some commit funding to go towards permanent farmland protection, encouraging them to continue to commit those resources to helping farm families permanently protect their land. And in the Farm Bill, I may be telling you something you already know, but it's the ASEP ALE program, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, agricultural land easements. And the funding for that is set to go way, way down unless we get some kind of restoration in this Farm Bill. And what AFT has been advocating for in this Farm Bill is $500 million, just so you know the number that we've been asking for. And then in your state governments, I believe now there are 26 states that have purchase of development rights programs where they put money towards helping farmers permanently protect their land. In New York here, we have one. You know, going in and advocating for those funds can also be an important part of a climate change agenda, mitigation agenda, not climate change agenda. And then some of you may be local planners or local officials. In New York, we're a home rule law state. At the local level, a lot of the decisions of whether we're going to keep land in farming or lose farmland happens at the local level. And you can advocate that your local officials make agriculture and protecting farmland a priority in their plans. The second one is New York specific, and the third one as well, but other states may have similar programs to help with land use planning and incorporating agriculture into land use planning. And it's important to advocate for those types of programs. So I'll also quickly mention that last fall, we ran some farmland protection forums at AFT New York in conjunction with the Legislative Commission on Rural Resources and the legislature here and the Department of Agriculture and Markets. We ran these forums to have people come and talk about how to protect farmland in their communities and the importance of doing so. And we've got some videos from that, which are at this link at the bottom of your screen right here. So if anybody wanted to watch any of those videos, if you're in New York, they are fairly New York specific, but I think that they have some ideas that could be generalizable across the nation. So those videos are available here, and it includes a presentation that we did on why protecting farmland is important and some of the things, some of the laws that you can write and adopt at the local level to do so. And then the Department of Agriculture and Markets also did a presentation, which is a little bit more New York specific, but if you're in New York, it's worth watching. And then finally, we have some tools available at the Farmland Information Center, as I mentioned before. This one on the left here, again, is New York specific, but has some of what we consider to be model local laws and ways to protect farmland in your community. And then here on the right is a new publication that AFT put out last year about strengthening local and regional food systems in your area. And that one is national in scope and worth reading, and it's available on the Farmland Information Center. It gives you some really good things to think about in starting to approach these types of questions of strengthening local and regional food systems in your area. And welcome any questions that you have. Oh, and the link to find the Greener Fields report right here.